When I first moved overseas, I honestly believed I had everything figured out. I spent months researching costs before I ever got on a plane. I compared rent prices, healthcare, groceries, visa fees, exchange rates, pretty much everything you can think of. I watched countless videos from people saying they were living comfortably overseas for a fraction of what life cost back in the United States, and after a while it started feeling less like some impossible dream and more like an actual plan I could realistically pull off myself. At that point in my life, I was burned out mentally more than anything else. It felt like every year back home got more expensive, more stressful, and honestly more exhausting to keep up with. Even when I was doing okay financially, I never really felt secure. There was always this pressure sitting in the background of everyday life, and after enough years of carrying that around, I think a part of me just wanted out. So when I finally made the decision to leave and start over overseas, I thought the biggest challenge would be financial. I thought the hardest part would be learning how to budget differently, figuring out visas, adjusting to another country, and making sure my money lasted long term. But looking back now, I realize money was actually the easiest part of the transition. The real cost of moving abroad had almost nothing to do with finances at all. And honestly, that's the part I wish more people talked about before I made such a massive life decision. The reason I wanted to share this story is because I think too many people online only show one side of moving overseas. They show the cheap apartments, restaurant meals, ocean views, and lower monthly expenses, but very few people talk honestly about what it actually feels like emotionally once the excitement wears off and this becomes your normal everyday life. And I'm not making this video to discourage anyone from doing it because overall, moving overseas absolutely changed my life in positive ways too. But I also think people deserve to hear the parts that usually get left out of the conversation, especially if they're seriously thinking about completely starting over later in life. In the beginning, almost everything felt exciting to me simply because it was different. Even basic everyday things that would have felt completely normal back in the United States suddenly felt interesting again. Walking through grocery stores, figuring out transportation, learning new apps, hearing different sounds outside every morning, all of it made life feel fresh in a way I honestly hadn't felt in years. For a while, I genuinely felt happier than I had back home because mentally it felt like I had finally broken out of the repetitive cycle my life had turned into before I moved. Back in the United States, my days had started feeling almost identical. Wake up, work, stress about money, pay bills, repeat the same routine over and over again. After enough years of living like that, I think I became emotionally exhausted without fully realizing how burned out I actually was until I finally left. And honestly, during those first several months overseas, I remember thinking to myself that I should have done it sooner. My money stretched further, I felt less financial pressure overall, and life no longer felt like this nonstop race where every unexpected expense immediately created stress. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could actually breathe a little mentally, and that feeling is real. I never want to pretend otherwise because I know some people online either romanticize moving abroad too much or they swing completely the other direction and act like it's a disaster. For me, neither extreme was true. There were absolutely parts of life overseas that improved my quality of life significantly. But eventually something started happening that I wasn't mentally prepared for at all. Little by little, the excitement stopped feeling like an adventure and started becoming normal everyday life instead. And when that shift happened, I started realizing that changing countries doesn't automatically change who you are internally. Once the honeymoon phase faded, all the distractions disappeared too, and I slowly started noticing emotional things I had ignored in the beginning because everything still felt so new at first. That's when I realized the hardest part of starting over overseas wasn't adapting to another country. It was understanding what I had actually left behind emotionally when I walked away from my old life. One of the hardest things for me to fully understand after moving overseas was how differently relationships start to feel once you've been gone long enough. Before I left, I honestly thought modern technology would make the distance feel smaller than it really was. I figured with video calls, messaging apps, social media, and instant communication, staying connected to people back home wouldn't be that difficult. And in the beginning, it almost felt true. I could still talk to family whenever I wanted. Friends could still send updates. I could still see pictures of birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, and everything happening back in the United States. At first, I convinced myself that I was still just as connected to everyone as I had always been. But after enough time passes, something slowly changes that's hard to explain unless you've actually experienced it yourself. You start realizing that seeing someone's life through a screen is completely different from actually being physically present in it. Life back home keeps moving forward whether you're there or not. Parents get older, kids grow up, friends move on with their lives. People build new routines that no longer include you in the same way they once did. And it's not because anyone stopped caring about you. That's the strange part. Nobody did anything wrong. It's just what naturally happens when years start passing and you're no longer physically part of people's everyday lives anymore. There were moments where that realization hit me a lot harder than I expected. Sometimes it would happen during holidays, sometimes after getting off a video call, or sometimes for no reason at all. I would suddenly realize how far away I actually was from the life I had spent decades building back home. And the older you get, the more you start understanding that time matters differently too. You become more aware that parents won't always be around forever. Family members get older, health changes, life changes. And there's a strange emotional weight that comes with knowing you chose to build a life thousands of miles away from the people you spent most of your life around. I think that's one of the biggest things people don't fully think about before moving abroad, especially later in life. Everybody focuses on the financial side because numbers are easy to calculate. You can compare rent prices and healthcare costs online in a single afternoon. But there's no spreadsheet that can really prepare you emotionally for what it feels like to slowly become disconnected from the life and relationships that once felt permanent. Another thing I had to learn the hard way was realizing that moving overseas does not magically erase the things you were struggling with before you left. And I know that probably sounds obvious when people hear it out loud, but when you feel burned out or unhappy with your life for a long time, part of you starts believing that changing your environment will completely change how you feel internally too. I think deep down that's what I was hoping for in the beginning. I thought if I could just remove myself from the stress, pressure, and constant financial anxiety I felt back in the United States, then somehow everything else inside me would improve automatically too. And in the beginning, it honestly does feel that way for a while because everything is still new enough to distract you. Your brain stays occupied constantly. You're learning different systems, different routines, different environments, different social norms. And for a period of time, all of that keeps your mind moving forward. But eventually, normal life catches up again no matter where you live. Daily routines return. Stress returns in different forms. You still have bad days, you still overthink things, you still carry your personality, your fears, your habits, and your emotional baggage with you even after moving halfway across the world. That realization hit me pretty hard because I think I had unknowingly turned moving overseas into something bigger in my mind than it realistically could ever be. I wasn't just looking for a cheaper place to live. I think part of me was hoping for a complete emotional reset too. And over time, I realized another country can absolutely improve certain parts of your life, especially financially, but it cannot completely rebuild your internal life for you. That part still takes work no matter where you live. There were also smaller daily stresses that slowly added up mentally in ways I never really expected before I moved. Simple things often became more complicated than they used to be back home. Visa renewals, banking issues, internet outages, power interruptions, trying to handle important situations when systems work completely differently from what you grew up with. Even after adjusting over time, there's still this constant feeling in the background that you're operating outside your comfort zone almost all the time. None of these things individually were major disasters for me, but together they created a kind of low-level mental fatigue that I honestly never saw people talk about, much before I moved abroad myself. And I think that's because most content online focuses almost entirely on visible things people can easily film: apartment tours, restaurant prices, beaches, shopping malls, cost comparisons. But the emotional side of rebuilding your life somewhere else is much harder to explain because a lot of it happens quietly inside your own head over long periods of time. The strange thing is, despite everything I've talked about, I still don't regret moving overseas. Not even close. And I think that's important for me to say because this isn't one of those stories where someone leaves their home country and then realizes they made some terrible mistake. That's not how I feel at all. In many ways, moving completely changed my life for the better. Financially, the lower cost of living gave me breathing room I honestly didn't feel like I had back in the United States anymore. The constant pressure I used to feel surrounding money became much more manageable once my expenses stopped consuming such a huge percentage of my life every month. And mentally, there was something valuable about forcing myself out of the environment I had been stuck in for so many years. But over time, my perspective changed completely on what moving abroad actually is. In the beginning, I think I viewed it almost like an escape. Like if I could just get far enough away from the stress, pressure, and burnout I felt back home, then life itself would somehow become easier emotionally too. What I eventually realized is that moving abroad is not really an escape at all. It's a trade-off. You gain certain freedoms, experiences, and opportunities, but you sacrifice things too. And some of those sacrifices are emotional ones that are difficult to fully understand until you've actually lived far away from everything familiar for several years. I also started realizing that home becomes a much more complicated idea after living overseas long enough. Before I moved, I thought home was mostly tied to a physical location, but now I understand it has more to do with familiarity, relationships, history, and the feeling of fully belonging somewhere without even thinking about it. And after enough years abroad, you start existing somewhere in between worlds. Part of you changes and adapts to your new life, but another part of you still stays connected to where you came from too. That feeling never completely disappears. And honestly, that's the main reason I wanted to make this video. Not to discourage people from moving overseas, but to give a more honest picture of what starting over later in life can actually feel like emotionally. Because I think too many people online only hear one side of the conversation. They hear about how cheap things are, they hear about stretching retirement savings further, they hear about escaping stress and living better for less money. And while some of those things can absolutely be true, very few people talk honestly about the emotional reality of leaving behind an entire life you spent decades building. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that changing your environment can absolutely improve your quality of life in many ways, but it won't automatically change who you are internally. That part still takes work no matter where you live. And maybe that's the real hidden cost of moving abroad that nobody talks about enough. It's not just the financial adjustment, it's realizing that starting over sounds exciting in theory, but emotionally it comes with sacrifices too. For some people, those sacrifices will absolutely be worth it. For others, they won't. But either way, I think people deserve to hear the full story before making a decision that completely changes the direction of their life.